Elsie arrived at the cottage as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky a canvas of deep purple streaked with orange. The wind carried the chill of impending winter through the Scottish Highlands, whispering secrets only the ancient land knew. She parked her car and stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel path leading up to the front door. The cottage, a legacy from a relative she'd never met, was more isolated than she had imagined, its stone walls and thatched roof blending into the rugged landscape. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a musty smell, laden with hints of damp earth and old wood, greeted her. Inside, the cottage was quaint, decorated with antique furniture that spoke of decades past and faded rugs that muffled her footsteps. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, cold and unused, with stacks of firewood beside it suggesting warmth on colder nights. In the corner of the room, a peculiar old radio sat on a dusty shelf. Its surface was marred by scratches, and the fabric of its speaker was frayed. Elsie ran her fingers over it, amused by its stubborn presence in such a modern age. She gave its knobs a tentative twist, and it crackled to life, emitting a burst of static before falling silent again. Deciding to explore the rest of the house, she left the radio behind, unaware of its whispered utterance of her name, so soft it was almost carried away by the wind. That night, after unpacking her few belongings, Elsie sat by the window in the small kitchen, sipping tea and looking out over the moor that stretched, unbroken, to the shadowy hills. The land was beautiful, serene yet somber, matching her mood. She had come here to escape, to find solace in solitude after the tumult of the past year. The cottage, with its lingering silences and whispered secrets, seemed a fitting place to do just that. As darkness enveloped the cottage, Elsie felt the first stirrings of unease. The wind seemed to howl with a mournful note, and the cottage creaked and settled around her as if it were alive. Shadows played across the walls, cast by the flickering light of the candles she had lit. In these shadows, she thought she saw movements, swift and fleeting, as if something or someone was just out of sight, watching. Trying to shake off the feeling, Elsie decided it was time for bed. The bedroom was upstairs, a cozy room under the eaves with a small window that looked out over the moor. The bed was old, with a heavy wooden frame and a mattress that sagged in the middle. She lay there, listening to the sounds of the house and the wind outside, and as she drifted towards sleep, the faint sound of music drifted up from downstairs. The radio, which she was sure she had turned off, was playing a soft, melancholic tune. In her half-sleep, Elsie wondered if she had really turned the radio off, or if the old wiring was to blame. The music, however, was oddly soothing, a melody from another time that seemed to whisper her name again, weaving through the notes a call to listen closer, to understand. But tiredness overcame her, and she fell asleep to the sound of the past. The radio's tune a lullaby that carried her into dreams shadowed by the whispering winds of the highlands. The next morning, Elsie awoke to a thick fog that had rolled in overnight, enveloping the cottage in a ghostly shroud. As she made her breakfast, the sense of being watched returned, more persistent now. The air felt charged, as if the cottage itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. And as she moved about, she noticed small anomalies. A book she was sure she had placed on the nightstand was now on the kitchen table. A window she had closed was ajar, letting in the cold morning air. Elsie tried to dismiss these oddities as the result of her forgetfulness, perhaps influenced by the unsettling atmosphere of the cottage. Yet, as she looked around, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon her, she knew something deeper was at play. The cottage, with its whispering walls and shifting shadows, held a story, a hidden truth cloaked in mystery and hinted at by the eerie whispers of her name from a radio that shouldn't work. Determined to understand, Elsie set aside her initial reason for coming, to grieve and to write, and instead opened herself to the story of the cottage, to the whispered secrets carried on the wind that seemed so intent on speaking to her alone. Elsie's second day at the cottage brought a morning of mist and soft rain that blurred the line between the earth and sky. As she sipped her coffee, staring out the rain-streaked window, the solitude she had initially embraced now felt heavy, like a thick woolen cloak that was both comforting and suffocating. The day passed slowly, the silence of the cottage punctuated only by the occasional creak of floorboards and the whispering wind. As she organized the small library in the living room, Elsie's fingers stumbled upon an array of old, dusty books, but one in particular caught her attention. It was a journal, bound in faded leather with the pages yellowed by time. The entries were written in a hurried, scribbling hand, detailing the daily life of a previous owner who spoke of loneliness and strange happenings that mirrored her own experiences. As the sky darkened and night fell, Elsie's sense of unease deepened. The wind seemed to carry voices, and the walls echoed with sounds that should not exist in such an empty place. Sitting by the fire, she tried to focus on her writing, but the crackling logs seemed to whisper her name. With each snap of the wood, her skin prickled with awareness of something unseen. The climax of the evening came suddenly. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the cottage into darkness as a storm broke overhead. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, stark flashes, and in those moments, Elsie saw shadows dancing across the walls, not merely distortions cast by the firelight, but as if they had a life of their own. The air grew cold, and she felt a distinct chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Grabbing a candle, Elsie decided to investigate the source of the sounds upstairs. The attic door was ajar, which was strange since she remembered it being closed earlier. Heart pounding, she ascended the narrow staircase, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The attic was crammed with forgotten furniture and boxes. As her light swept over the dusty floor, it caught on something unexpected, an old trunk with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse under her gaze. Curiosity overcoming her fear, Elsie knelt before the trunk and opened it. Inside were letters and photographs, the faces of people long gone staring back at her with expressions frozen in time. As she sifted through the contents, the wind outside grew into a howl, and the attic seemed to breathe around her, the walls contracting like the chest of a sleeping giant. Among the letters was a diary different from the one she found earlier. This one was newer, its entries filled with notes on local folklore involving the cottage and the moor. The previous owner had been obsessed with legends of spirits and protective wards against unseen forces. It was unsettling how the words mirrored the eerie occurrences in the cottage, suggesting that what Elsie was experiencing was not merely the product of her imagination. Returning downstairs with the diary and letters, Elsie felt a presence behind her every step of the way. Back in the safety of the living room, she pored over the diary by the light of the fire. The entries spoke of a guardian of the cottage, a spirit that watched over the place and its inhabitants. The writer had felt its presence, a protective force yet deeply sorrowful, tied to the land and its history. As she read, the wind seemed to carry voices, soft and whispering, as if the moor itself was speaking. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the fire crackled with a comforting rhythm, and the shadows seemed to retreat slightly, as if respecting the space around her. Elsie realized that the cottage, with all its quirks and sounds, was communicating in its way, reaching out through the veil of the past with stories of those who had once called it home. Despite the fear, a deep fascination grew within her, a desire to understand the history and mysteries of the cottage. The sensation of being watched didn't feel threatening anymore. Instead, it was as if the house itself was acknowledging her presence, welcoming her into its fold. As the night progressed, the storm outside calmed, and the cottage seemed to settle, the earlier feelings of dread dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Elsie, surrounded by the artifacts of lives once lived, felt a strange sense of belonging, as if the cottage had accepted her as part of its long and storied history. That night, Elsie couldn't sleep. The diary's revelations had ignited a fire of curiosity within her that refused to be doused. Lying in her bed, staring at the shadows that danced across the ceiling, she felt a pull towards the mysterious study mentioned in the diary. The cottage seemed to hum with a charged energy, as if it was awaiting her discovery. Summoning her courage, she got out of bed and approached the large stone fireplace in the living room. The diary had hinted at a mechanism, a hidden catch that would reveal what lay beyond. Feeling along the cold, rough stone, her fingers found a small notch just beneath the mantel. She pressed it, and with a grinding sound that echoed through the still house, part of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Heart racing, she grabbed a candle and stepped into the passage. It led to a small room that was remarkably preserved. Unlike the rest of the cottage, this room was devoid of dust and cobwebs. A large, ornate mirror dominated one wall, its surface gleaming in the candlelight, reflecting her image back at her with startling clarity. The room was filled with shelves of old books and strange artifacts that whispered of ancient rituals and forgotten lore. In the center of the room, a heavy desk sat laden with parchments and vials of strange substances. But it was the mirror that drew her in, its presence almost magnetic. As she stood before the mirror, the air around her grew perceptibly cooler. The flame of her candle flickered, as if in response to an unseen breath. Then, the surface of the mirror seemed to liquidate, rippling under an invisible touch. Elsie watched, breath held, as images began to form. The mirror showed her things, visions of the past and tantalizing glimpses of possible futures. She saw the cottage as it had been centuries ago, alive with the laughter of children and the warmth of a loving family. She saw the woman from the diary, her face marked with the sorrow of loss and the burden of knowledge. The mirror pulled her deeper, offering her a path away from her grief, a chance to live in these moments of joy and peace. It was enticing, overwhelmingly so. Elsie's heart ached with the desire to step through the glass, to escape her reality of loneliness and loss, to live in a world where the shadows held no fear and the whispers spoke only of love. She reached out, her fingers just grazing the cool surface of the glass, the images swirling faster, pulling at her soul. But something held her back, a voice in her mind, a whisper of reason that spoke of reality and the impossibility of such fantasies. It told her that to enter the mirror was to leave her world behind, to give up on the future that was still hers to shape. With a monumental effort, Elsie pulled her hand back. The images in the mirror swirled angrily, then dissipated, leaving only her own reflection looking back at her with eyes wide with unshed tears. The room grew warm again, the air settling into a heavy silence that wrapped around her like a blanket. She turned away from the mirror, her decision made but her heart heavy with the weight of what she had refused. The room seemed to acknowledge her choice, the earlier feeling of anticipation now replaced with a somber calm. As she left the room, closing the hidden door behind her, the cottage felt different, less like a place of haunting and more like a home. The rest of the night passed in quiet reflection. Elsie understood now that the cottage, with all its mysteries and whispers, was not a place to be feared but to be respected. It was a keeper of histories, of lives once lived and loves once lost, and now, of her story too. She felt a connection to the woman in the diary, a kindred spirit who had faced her own sorrows with courage and grace. As dawn broke over the moors, Elsie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The shadows retreated with the night, and the whispers faded into the morning breeze. The horror of the unknown had been faced and understood, not as a threat, but as an integral part of the cottage's charm. Elsie knew she would leave this place eventually, return to her life and her unfinished book, but she would not be the same. She had looked into the mirror, into the abyss of her fears, and had found not darkness but a reflection of her own strength. As the days began to lengthen and the harsh winds of the highlands softened into a gentler breeze, Elsie found that the cottage no longer felt like a place of mystery and whispers, but more like a sanctuary. Her mornings were spent writing, the words flowing freely now, inspired by the events she had lived through and the emotional journey she had endured. Her afternoons were for long walks on the moors, where the vast, open skies and the earthy smell of heather soothed her soul. Though she had decided to remain in the real world, rejecting the alluring escape offered by the mirror, the decision came with a profound sense of melancholy mixed with relief. Each day, she passed the hidden room without opening it, knowing what lay beyond but no longer feeling the pull as she once did. The cottage seemed to respect her choice, its ambience now more nurturing than haunting. Elsie's story, once stuck in the depths of her grief, now unfolded on the pages with a new perspective, a narrative of healing and discovery, of facing one's demons and finding that the real magic lay in the reality she had chosen to accept. Her protagonist, no longer a mere character, had become a reflection of her own resilience, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to overcome sorrow and fear. The whispering radio had grown silent over the weeks, its previous murmurs fading into nothing more than a memory. Sometimes, Elsie would touch it, half expecting it to spring to life once more. But it remained quiet, its purpose served. It stood as a reminder of the thin veil between past and present, a conduit for the voices of the cottage's former inhabitants who had reached out through time, seeking understanding and perhaps redemption. One evening, as the sun set in a spectacular display of red and orange, painting the sky with the colors of fire, Elsie sat by the fireplace, a finished manuscript lying beside her. The cottage, with its creaking wood and settling stones, seemed to breathe a sigh of contentment. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and earth, a natural symphony that played softly through the open window. It was then that she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was not from the radio this time, but from the direction of the mirror's hidden room. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, a farewell, or perhaps a thank you, from the depths of the cottage's heart. Elsie smiled, not with fear but with a deep, abiding affection for this place that had become a part of her story, her recovery. The final days at the cottage passed in a peaceful blur. Elsie packed her belongings, her manuscript safely tucked away, its pages filled with the truth of her experiences. She left the cottage as the first light of dawn crept across the moors, the house appearing stoic and proud against the lightening sky. As she drove away, Elsie looked back in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something extraordinary. But there was only the cottage, small and distant now, its windows catching the first rays of the sun, looking for all the world like any ordinary home. Yet she knew better. She carried with her the memories, the whispers, and the lessons learned in its rooms. Back in her own home, the manuscript found its way to a publisher, and soon, Elsie's story, woven with elements of the real and the surreal, was bound and distributed, a piece of her soul shared with the world. Readers wrote to her, touched by the tale of the haunted cottage on the moors, moved by the blend of reality and fantasy that spoke to their own fears and dreams. Elsie often thought of the cottage, wondering about the mirror and the room that held it. In her heart, she believed that the spirits of the place, the echoes of lives once lived there, continued their watch over the lonely moor. And sometimes, in the quiet of night, when the wind rose high and the world seemed alive with possibility, she could swear she heard a whisper, carried on the breeze, calling her name, soft and inviting. But she never went back, choosing instead to cherish the memory, to embrace the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. The cottage remained, a character in her story, a chapter of her life closed but forever etched in her heart, a poignant reminder of the journey she had taken from the depths of despair to the heights of acceptance and beyond. Alex arrived in the sleepy, fog-swathed village just as dusk began to settle over the dense canopy of the surrounding forest. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine and a hint of wood smoke from distant chimneys. The cottage he had rented for the month stood on the edge of the village, an old timber structure with peeling paint and creaky shutters, nestled against the backdrop of towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. As he unpacked, Alex felt a peculiar sense of being watched, though a quick glance through the windows confirmed he was alone. The cottage was quaint, filled with antique furniture and heavy, embroidered drapes that blocked out the chilling evening air. In the attic, where he decided to set up his writing space, he found a journal buried beneath a stack of musty books. It was bound in leather, the pages yellowed with age, the handwriting inside shaky and hurried. The entries were sparse, cryptic notes that spoke of beauty and terror intertwined in the shadow of the woods. The last entry, dated several years back, ended with a scribbled warning. "Do not look into the forest at night, for it looks back at you." That night, as Alex lay in bed, the silence of the cottage was broken by the soft, eerie whisper of wind chimes, though there was no wind. The sound seemed almost deliberate, a gentle clanging that resonated with a dissonant melody. It was soothing yet unsettling, and Alex found himself fixated on the noise as he drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground, obscuring the path that led into the village. Alex spent the day in the attic, attempting to write, but his mind kept drifting back to the journal. He read it again, this time noting the margins filled with sketches of twisted, humanoid figures that seemed to dance among the trees. The more he read, the more the soft whispers seemed to grow in volume, now discernible as murmurs that beckoned him from outside. By the third day, the whispers had grown into voices, too soft to fully understand, but clear enough to feel their presence. They weren't threatening, but they carried a melancholy that was palpable. Alex found himself drawn to the window, peering out into the fog-laden forest, tempted by the journal's warning and the mysterious voices to look deeper into the woods. Each night, the whispers continued, a little louder each time, and Alex began to feel a presence, something ancient and sorrowful, lurking in the shadows of the trees. He started to leave the recorder on overnight, hoping to capture the voices, to prove to himself he wasn't losing his grip on reality. On the sixth night, he played back the recording. Amidst the static and the whistling wind, there were voices, whispering his name, inviting him into the forest. The fear and curiosity mingled within him, a potent cocktail that kept him awake, staring out the window at the black silhouette of the forest against the night sky. It was then that he noticed the subtle movements, shadows shifting between the trees, almost imperceptible, as if the darkness itself was alive. His heart raced, not with fear, but with an unexplained exhilaration. He felt a strange kinship with whatever watched him from the woods, a connection that threaded through the eerie stillness of the night. Determined to delve deeper into the mystery, Alex spent his days exploring the village, gathering tales from locals who spoke of spirits in the forest, lost souls of villagers who had wandered into the woods and never returned. Each story added a layer to the enigma, painting a picture of a place caught between realms where the living and the dead whispered through the leaves. As the days passed, Alex's initial trepidation gave way to a profound fascination. The journal became his constant companion, the entries now familiar as he pieced together the tale it told. A tale of beauty found in the heart of darkness, of peace brokered with the spectral inhabitants of the woods. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to prick the sky, Alex sat at his desk in the attic, the journal open before him. The whispers rose once more, a chorus of ethereal voices that seemed closer than ever. They were no longer just sounds to be feared or mysteries to be solved. They were the musings of the forest itself, inviting him to listen, to understand. Alex picked up his pen, his hands steady as he began to write not just about the forest and its lost souls, but for them. His words flowed onto the paper, a stream of thoughts and feelings guided by the gentle, insistent whispers of the night. As he wrote, the cottage felt warmer, the whispers softer, and for the first time since he had arrived, Alex felt completely and utterly at home. Over the following days, Alex's initial curiosity turned into a deepening obsession. The journal's entries, once enigmatic and disconcerting, began to unfold a narrative that paralleled his own experiences. Each whisper, each shadow in the night, now seemed to carry a piece of a puzzle that Alex was desperate to solve. The forest no longer felt merely a backdrop to his stay, but had become a living, breathing entity, with each rustle of the leaves and distant snap of twigs weaving itself into his nightly recordings. The cottage, with its creaking floors and sighing walls, seemed to resonate with a new intensity as the division between the inside and the outside world blurred. The wind chimes continued to sound at odd hours, their tones no longer random but seeming to carry a deliberate message, a coded communication that Alex strained to understand. He began to leave the windows open at night, inviting the sounds of the forest into his makeshift study, allowing the cool, damp air to fill the room, carrying with it the earthy scent of moss and bark. As he delved deeper into the village's history, Alex discovered tales of a midwinter festival that had been celebrated for centuries, a night when the villagers would venture into the forest to leave offerings for the spirits they believed protected them. The festival had ceased years ago under mysterious circumstances, a detail that locals spoke of only reluctantly. Intrigued, Alex decided to recreate this ritual, hoping to connect further with the spectral entities he felt certain were reaching out to him. One evening, under the thin silver crescent of a new moon, he gathered old, forgotten tokens from the cottage. Candles, a string of faded beads, and a small, hand-carved wooden figurine he found tucked away in a drawer. He arranged these on a cleared patch of earth at the forest's edge, the candlelight flickering shadows across the dark woods. The air was still, heavy with expectation, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As the candles burned lower, the night grew deeper around him, and the whispers swelled into a low chorus. It was no longer just murmurs but clear voices, each word pronounced with a haunting clarity. They spoke of loneliness, of being forgotten, of yearning for contact. Alex listened, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a profound empathy, his earlier apprehensions drowned out by his connection to these lost voices. His nights became a ritual of writing, listening, and responding. He felt less like an outsider and more a part of the cottage and the woods than he had ever felt anywhere else. His sleep, when it came, was deep and filled with vivid dreams of shadowy figures dancing between the trees, their movements graceful and sad. But one night, the atmosphere shifted. The air turned colder, the whispers more urgent. He woke from a restless sleep to the sensation of cold fingers brushing against his cheek. Startled, he sat up, scanning the dark room. The candle he had left burning had flickered out, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he could see his breath misting in the air. The following morning, Alex found fresh marks outside his bedroom window. A series of footprints that led from the forest, stopping abruptly at the glass pane as though whatever had left them had spent the night watching him. The realization that the spirits might not be merely benign watchers, but participants in this unfolding drama brought a new layer of intrigue and intensity to his stay. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, Alex set out deeper into the woods than he had before, his camera and recorder in hand. He ventured off the worn paths, guided by the subtle pull of the whispers, which seemed to beckon him onward. The deeper into the forest he went, the stronger the presence felt, until the air around him seemed thick with the weight of unspoken words. He stumbled upon a clearing he had never seen before, where the trees parted to reveal a circle of stones, moss-covered and arranged with deliberate precision. It was an ancient place, sacred and untouched, and as he stepped into the circle, the whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a profound silence. Here, he felt the boundary between the living and the spectral dissolve, as if he had crossed into a realm where time and death held no dominion. Captured by the sanctity of the spot, Alex set up his equipment and began to record, speaking softly into the stillness, asking questions, pleading for answers. The air vibrated with the potential of contact, every nerve in his body attuned to the slightest change in the atmosphere, every sense heightened in anticipation of what might come next. That night, after returning from the stone circle, Alex reviewed the footage and audio recordings he had captured. The camera had recorded only the stillness of the forest, but the audio device had picked up something extraordinary, a clear, distinct voice, speaking in a whisper yet unmistakably articulate. "Why have you come?" it asked, and in the background, the faint, sorrowful melody of a flute played, as if carried by the wind. Alex sat back, stunned. The voice was neither menacing nor welcoming, imbued with a profound sadness that resonated deeply with him. It was as though the spirits of the forest were not just aware of his presence, but were actively engaging with him, questioning his intentions. This breakthrough was both exhilarating and daunting, as it confirmed that his interactions were not merely one-sided. He was, in fact, communicating with whatever resided within the woods. Compelled by this discovery, Alex decided to spend the night in the stone circle, equipped with his camera, audio recorder, and a small fire to ward off the chill of the deep forest. As darkness enveloped him, the usual chorus of whispers returned, but now they were interspersed with clearer, more direct communication. "Remember us," one voice implored, while another seemed to sing a low, haunting lullaby. Throughout the night, Alex posed questions to the air, speaking directly to the spirits. He asked about their stories, why they remained, and what they desired from him. The answers came sporadically, in fragments of emotions conveyed through whispers and the eerie music that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath him. They spoke of lost memories, of time blurring into oblivion, and a longing for recognition, for their existence to be acknowledged and remembered. As dawn approached, the emotional weight of the night's experiences overwhelmed Alex. He felt a connection to these spectral beings, a shared loneliness, and an understanding of what it meant to be forgotten. His role, he realized, was not just as an observer but as a conduit through which their stories could be told, their presence affirmed to the world. He spent the morning in silence, reflecting on the revelations of the night. His notes became more than just observations. They were now testimonials of the spirit's existence, a narrative he was determined to share. The novel he had planned on writing took on a new direction, one that intertwined his experiences with the historical lore of the village, blurring the lines between fiction and reality. With each passing day, Alex's fear subsided, replaced by a profound sense of duty. He understood that his initial fear of the forest and its inhabitants stemmed from ignorance, from the unknown. Now, armed with knowledge and understanding, he felt a deep respect and a protective sense of guardianship over the spirits. They were no longer just voices and shadows. They had become his muses, his unseen companions in solitude. By his last night in the cottage, Alex felt a bittersweet melancholy. Packing his belongings, he felt as though he was leaving behind old friends. He left the stone circle set up as he had found it, untouched and pristine, a sacred space that he had been privileged to enter. Before he departed, he placed a copy of his manuscript, filled with the stories and voices of the forest, in the attic where he had first found the journal. It was his gift back to the cottage, a token of gratitude for the inspiration it had provided. That evening, Alex stood once more at the threshold of the forest, looking into the dense, shadowy thicket. He felt the eyes of the forest on him, not with malice, but with a silent acknowledgement. He realized he was no longer an outsider, but a part of the forest's vast, timeless story. As he turned to leave, a soft whisper carried through the trees, a simple, heartfelt farewell. The drive back to civilization was quiet, reflective. Alex knew he was returning a changed man, his life enriched by an experience that transcended ordinary reality. The novel he would publish would speak of these experiences, inviting others to listen, to understand, and perhaps to visit the sleepy, fog-laden village that housed spirits not of terror, but of forgotten histories eager to be told. As the forest faded into the distance, Alex carried with him the peace and the haunting melodies of a place suspended between the veils of the seen and the unseen. Eleanor stepped softly into the cottage, her shoes leaving faint impressions on the dusty wooden floor. The air was thick with the scent of old pine and a hint of lavender, perhaps lingering from her grandmother's time. The cottage, nestled on the edge of a sleepily murmuring village, seemed to lean slightly, as if trying to listen to the secrets of the dense woods that surrounded it. She felt an inexplicable connection to this place, as if the whispering wind in the leaves was part of a forgotten childhood dream. As she wandered through the small, creaky rooms, Eleanor discovered that the cottage was much like a time capsule. Each room held relics of a bygone era, faded wallpapers, heavy drapes that filtered the sunlight to a soft glow, and shelves lined with old books whose pages whispered as she flipped through them. The air inside felt cool and slightly damp, adding a tangible weight to the silence that hung between the tick of an old grandfather clock. In the attic, under the eaves where the sound of the rain could be distinctly heard tapping a staccato rhythm on the roof, Eleanor found a peculiar music box made of dark, polished wood inlaid with mother of pearl. It was an exquisite piece, oddly out of place amid the dusty trunks and moth-eaten fabrics. Curiosity piqued, she wound it up, expecting a melody. Instead, it produced a series of sounds that were more akin to hushed, discordant whispers than to any tune she knew. The sounds seemed to linger in the air, unsettling yet compelling. That night, as a light fog rolled in from the woods, Eleanor felt the edges of her consciousness blur into sleep. Her dreams, however, were vivid tapestries woven with shadows and moonlight. She wandered a version of the woods that was both alien and familiar, where the trees seemed to breathe and the mist held voices that called her name with a mournful urgency. Waking with a start in the dim hours before dawn, she found herself listening intently to the house. the real and imagined sounds blending until she wasn't sure if the faint calling of her name had been a dream at all. Over the next few days, Eleanor noticed small changes around the cottage. A vase of wildflowers appeared to wilt and revive in the span of hours. Photographs seemed to flicker with unseen expressions, and the air would occasionally turn inexplicably cold, raising goosebumps on her arms. The village itself was quaint, its residents friendly, but with a reserved demeanor that hinted at unspoken stories. In her conversations, she caught veiled references to traditions and old pacts made with the woods, though no one would elaborate. She spent her evenings poring over her grandmother's diaries, which she found in a locked drawer along with a rusty key. The writings were a mixture of everyday accounts and strange, poetic passages about the spirits of the forest, the guardians of the village, and the duties passed down through generations. It was as if her grandmother had lived in a world that straddled the line between the seen and the unseen, the spoken and the silenced. The more Eleanor read, the more she felt drawn to the grove at the edge of the property, where the trees stood so densely together they seemed to swallow sound. One twilight, unable to curb her growing obsession, she ventured there. The woods welcomed her with cool, whispering breezes that tugged playfully at her hair, as if beckoning her deeper into their green-shrouded mysteries. As the sky darkened to a deep velvet, she felt her fears dissipate, replaced by an ancestral pull that guided her steps through the underbrush to an old stone well covered in creeping ivy. There, the air was thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the well itself seemed to exude a quiet sorrow. As she approached, the whispers grew into coherent pleas, echoes of the past that seemed desperate to be heard. She realized then that this place was much more than a mere geographical location. It was a nexus of histories, personal and communal, bound by roots deeper than the woods themselves. Eleanor's days began to fold into one another, each marked by a growing sense of unease that fluttered at the edge of her perception like a moth at a lamp. Her nights were restless, threaded with dreams that seemed more memory than fantasy, where the woods whispered secrets meant for her alone. Each morning, she awoke with a start, the remnants of whispers clinging to her consciousness, urging her to look deeper, to understand more. As she immersed herself in the village's daily rhythms, the peculiar occurrences at the cottage became more frequent. The music box, once just an oddity, now seemed to act as a catalyst for these phenomena. Sometimes, the air around it vibrated with a palpable intensity, as if it were about to shatter the quiet of the house with its silent screams. Other times, it played its eerie non-melody while no one was near, its lid fluttering open as though operated by unseen hands. The villagers kept their distance from the grove and the well, casting it wary glances that spoke of old fears and deep superstitions. They spoke in hushed tones about the balance of things, about respect and boundaries not to be crossed. Yet they offered no concrete explanations. Their ambiguity only fueled Eleanor's curiosity, pushing her further into her own investigations. She found herself drawn repeatedly to the attic, where she uncovered more of her grandmother's belongings. A collection of old journals, letters, and photographs. The more she read, the more she realized that her grandmother had been deeply involved in something far beyond the quaint traditions of a small village. There were references to guardianship, to sacrifices made for the greater good, and to a pact that was as vital as it was terrifying. One particular journal caught her attention. It was newer than the others and contained entries that were increasingly erratic, filled with sketches of the woods and the well, annotated with frantic, scribbled notes about needing to renew and preserve the pact. The last entry was a hastily written warning. Do not let the song end. Outside, the weather turned as if reflecting the darkening mood of her quest. Winds howled at night, sending branches scratching against the cottage windows like desperate fingers. Shadows seemed to gather with intent in the corners of rooms, dispersing only when directly confronted. Eleanor's sense of isolation grew. She felt the eyes of the village on her as she walked through its streets, their looks a mix of pity and dread. One elder, his face lined with the weight of years, finally approached her. In a trembling voice, he spoke of the old ways, of the importance of the pact her family had maintained with the spirit of the woods. It's not about fear, he whispered. It's about respect, about living together with those who were here long before us. Driven by a mix of fear and responsibility, Eleanor decided to visit the grove by night. As the moon carved shadows out of the darkness, she felt her way forward, the chill of the air wrapping around her like a cloak. The whispering intensified, a chorus of urgent voices that seemed to swell with the wind. At the grove, the well awaited, its presence now overwhelming. The whispers turned to pleas, echoing up from the deep, dark below. Eleanor, heart pounding with a mix of dread and resolve, knew what she needed to do. She began to sing softly, a lullaby her grandmother had once hummed, a melody that now seemed eerily appropriate. As she sang, the air shifted, the temperature rising slightly, the wind easing its frantic dance. By the time she finished her song, the night felt less oppressive, the shadows less menacing. The whispers did not cease, but there was a new quality to them, a sort of satisfied waiting. Eleanor understood then that her role was not merely one of inheritance, but of active participation. She was to be a keeper of a tradition that bridged the natural and the supernatural, a mediator between the past and the present. As she made her way back to the cottage, the music box began to play on its own once more. But this time, the notes were clear, almost sweet. It was as though the cottage itself was settling, the eerie occurrences giving way to a watchful peace. Yet, the feeling of being watched never fully dissipated, as if the eyes of the woods were constantly upon her, waiting to see what she would do next. The days following Eleanor's nocturnal visit to the grove brought a subtle but noticeable change to her surroundings. The air around the cottage seemed lighter, and even the villagers' stares softened slightly, tinged with a cautious respect rather than outright fear. She felt an unspoken acknowledgement of her actions, as if she had passed an unseen test. Yet, the gravity of her responsibility weighed heavily upon her, a constant companion amidst the solitude of the cottage. Eleanor's research into her grandmother's documents became more focused, driven by a need to understand the exact nature of the pact she had inadvertently inherited. The text spoke of a spirit of the woods, a guardian of sorts, that protected the village but also demanded observance of ancient rites and traditions. These rites appeared to be cyclical, tied to the natural rhythms of the earth and moon, and crucial for maintaining harmony between the village and the spectral forces that lingered at its edges. In her grandmother's writings, Eleanor found cryptic references to a renewal ceremony, one that required specific offerings and words to be spoken at the well. The offerings were simple yet symbolically powerful. A lock of hair from a willing descendant of the original pact makers, water drawn from the well at midnight, and a melody played on the music box. The ceremony was to be performed under the full moon, providing a direct connection to the celestial forces that govern the unseen world. Determined to fulfill her role, Eleanor prepared for the ceremony. As the full moon approached, she collected each item with care, feeling the ancient power woven into the very act of gathering them. The night of the ceremony was clear, with the moon casting a silver glow that seemed to illuminate her path with an ethereal light. At the well, Eleanor laid out the items before her. She placed the lock of her hair into the water she had drawn, watching as it floated gently on the surface, mingling with the moon's reflection. With a deep breath, she began to sing the melody that the music box had played, the notes floating into the night, carried by a gentle breeze. As she sang, the air around the well stirred, the water rippling as if touched by an unseen hand. A sense of calm enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chilling dread that had initially accompanied her encounters with the spirit. It was as if the woods themselves were listening, acknowledging her efforts to restore balance. When the song ended, Eleanor spoke the words she had read in her grandmother's journal, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the ritual. By the blood of the covenant and the breath of the forest, let this pact be renewed. The words seemed to hang in the air, resonating with a power that Eleanor could feel vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. The response was immediate and profound. A warm wind swept through the grove, rustling the leaves in a whispering applause. The water in the well glowed briefly, a soft luminescence that faded as quickly as it had appeared. The feeling of being watched receded, replaced by a profound peace that spread through the woods and back to the cottage. Returning to the cottage, Eleanor felt a shift in its atmosphere. The music box, silent since she had taken it to the grove, now played occasionally on its own, each time exuding a warmth that permeated the room. The photographs on the walls seemed to settle into more cheerful expressions, and the air inside the cottage warmed, as if the building itself was breathing a sigh of relief. In the following days, Eleanor noticed that the village seemed brighter, the people more open in their interactions with her. They spoke of fewer strange occurrences, fewer shadows at the periphery of their vision. It was as if her actions had not only renewed the pact, but also reinforced the barriers between the seen and unseen worlds. As she continued to live in the cottage, Eleanor realized that her role as the guardian of the pact was not a burden to be borne alone, but a legacy to be embraced and protected. It connected her not only to her grandmother and the generations before her, but also to the village and the natural world around her. This connection, once fully accepted, provided not just solace but a deep, enduring sense of purpose. In the weeks that followed the ritual, the cottage settled into a strange harmony. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with unspoken dread, but there was an undeniable presence lingering at the edges of Eleanor's awareness. She began to notice subtle changes, things that might have seemed inconsequential to anyone else but held deep meaning to her. The once faded wildflowers in the garden now thrived, their vibrant colors returning in hues that seemed almost otherworldly. The whispers that had once sent shivers down her spine softened into a kind of lullaby, a gentle reassurance that she was never truly alone. Eleanor spent more time exploring the woods, feeling the pull of their quiet mystery. The grove around the well became a sanctuary, a place where she could sit and feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath her. The whispers were still there, but they had changed. They were no longer pleading, but instead seemed to carry a sense of gratitude. The spirit, whatever it truly was, had accepted her as its keeper, and in return, it offered her a strange kind of companionship. The villagers, too, grew more comfortable in her presence. Though they never spoke openly of the pact, their demeanor toward her had shifted. They greeted her with cautious smiles and nodded in quiet respect as she passed. There was an unspoken understanding that she had taken on a role they neither envied nor questioned. One of the elders, the same man who had warned her about the importance of the pact, stopped her in the market one day. He pressed a small, intricately carved charm into her hand and whispered, "For protection. Even a guardian needs to be guarded." Despite the newfound peace, Eleanor could not entirely shake the sense of something unfinished. Her dreams persisted, though they were no longer filled with fear. Instead, they were hauntingly beautiful, images of the woods bathed in moonlight, the well glowing faintly, and shadowy figures watching from the edges, their faces obscured but their intentions no longer hostile. These dreams felt like messages, reminders of the delicate balance she now maintained. One evening, as she organized her grandmother's journals and papers, she found something she had missed before: a thin, leather-bound book hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer. Its pages were filled with an unfamiliar script, one that seemed to shift and shimmer as she tried to focus on it. At the very back of the book was a single blank page, except for a name written in her grandmother's handwriting: Eleanor. The sight of her name there sent a chill through her, though not one of fear. It felt as though her grandmother had known all along that she would be the one to take up this mantle. The book seemed to hum faintly in her hands, its weight far heavier than its physical size. She set it aside, unsure of what to make of it, but the discovery left her with a lingering unease that she couldn't quite shake. In the nights that followed, Eleanor began to notice small changes again, though these were different from before. The shadows that had once retreated seemed to creep back, just at the edges of her vision. The music box, which had been silent since the ritual, played faintly in the middle of the night, the tune slower and more melancholic than before. The whispers grew louder, though their tone was not hostile. Instead, they carried a sense of urgency, as if trying to convey something she could not yet understand. One night, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, Eleanor returned to the grove. The woods were silent, their usual symphony of rustling leaves and chirping insects absent. The air was still, almost heavy, and the moonlight seemed dimmer than usual. At the well, she found the surface of the water disturbingly still, reflecting her face back at her with an unsettling clarity. As she stood there, the whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice. It was neither male nor female, young nor old, but something in between. A voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the well and from within her own mind. "The pact is kept," it said, "but the balance is fragile." Eleanor felt a chill run through her as the voice continued, speaking in riddles and fragments that hinted at an unending cycle. The spirit was bound to the woods, but its existence was tied to the actions of the villagers and their guardian. The balance she had restored was not permanent. It required vigilance and understanding, an ongoing commitment to the unseen forces that shaped the world around her. As the voice faded, the water in the well rippled, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw something moving beneath the surface, something vast and ancient, watching her with a quiet intensity. The moment passed, and the grove returned to its usual stillness, but the encounter left her deeply unsettled. Back at the cottage, Eleanor sat by the fire, the leather-bound book in her lap. She opened it to the blank page with her name and placed her hand over the text. For a brief moment, she felt a warmth beneath her palm, as though the book were alive. When she removed her hand, new words had appeared beneath her name. "The Keeper endures." The phrase echoed in her mind as she stared into the fire. She realized then that her role was not just about maintaining the pact. It was about understanding the intricate web of connections between the natural and the supernatural, the living and the dead. The pact was not a single act but a continuous thread, one that required her to weave her own life into its fabric. As the days turned to weeks, Eleanor settled into her new reality. The cottage and the woods became her world, a space where the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted. The music box continued to play its enigmatic tunes, and the whispers never truly faded, but they became part of the rhythm of her life. The villagers, too, seemed to accept her role, offering quiet support when needed, but never prying into her affairs. Eleanor often returned to the grove, not out of fear, but out of a sense of duty and connection. She knew now that her presence there was as much for her own understanding as it was for the spirit. The well remained a constant reminder of the pact's weight and the balance she was sworn to uphold. The story did not end with a neat conclusion. There were no clear answers, no definitive resolutions. Eleanor's life had become a delicate dance with the unknown, a responsibility she carried with both trepidation and reverence. As the whispers wove through the woods and the music box played its haunting melodies, she understood that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, only lived. And in that understanding, she found a strange, enduring peace. In a quaint village nestled among dense, whispering forests and misty hills, Emily found her new sanctuary. Recently escaping the chaotic pace of city life, she was drawn to the tranquility and stories woven into the fabric of this place. Her neighbors were few, mostly older, their faces etched with the lines of many winters and eyes twinkling with secrets of the past. The village's centerpiece, spoken of in hushed tones and often with a glance thrown over the shoulder, was the old mill. Abandoned for decades, it sat on the outskirts, bordering the dense woods that some dared not enter as night fell. Emily, with her keen interest in folklore and an eye for photography, became captivated by the tales surrounding the mill. The most chilling was of the miller who vanished without a trace one stormy night, leaving behind only his hat and a lantern still burning by the now-still millstone. Armed with her camera, Emily set out one overcast morning to capture the essence of the mill. The path was well-trodden at the start, villagers frequently coming this close, but no further. As she approached, the air grew damp, the sky a heavier gray, as if the place itself consumed the light. The mill, cloaked in ivy, its walls stooped with age, stood as a guardian of forgotten times. Upon her arrival, she was greeted by the unexpected sight of an open door, as if the mill itself had been expecting her. The wind seemed to whisper around her, rustling through the trees and the decrepit wooden slats of the mill with a soft, mournful whistle. Emily stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space that smelled of old wood and earth. It was cooler here, the light dim, filtered through the dirty windows and casting eerie shadows. Her first photo was meant to capture the general aura of the interior. however, when she reviewed the image, her breath caught. There, in the upper window that she could see through the open loft, was the vague outline of a face. It wasn't there when she had looked up moments before. Or had it been? The photo showed what her eyes had missed, or perhaps what only her camera could see. Intrigued and unnerved, Emily ventured deeper into the mill. Each room told a story of years passed in silence. Tools lay scattered, and the personal effects of the miller were dust-covered but undisturbed. As she made her way through the narrow corridors and up the creaking stairs, her camera unexpectedly clicked, capturing photo after photo without her command. Each frame revealed subtle changes not visible to her naked eye. Shadows lengthened, the outlines of figures almost perceptible in the periphery. Her heart raced slightly, the thrill of the ghostly intertwining with fear. She paused, considering the elders' warnings of the mill. Their words were meant as cautionary tales, not invitations. Yet here she was, driven by a desire to peel back the veil of mystery shrouding this place. The whispers grew louder, a soft cacophony of sighs that seemed almost human. As if in response, her camera captured a particularly clear photo. A shadow standing at the foot of the stairs, tall and thin, its form blurred but unmistakably human. As the day waned, the interior of the mill darkened, urging Emily to leave. With every step toward the exit, the whispers grew fainter, the air lighter. Once outside, she breathed deeply, the fresh air expelling the heaviness from her lungs. She looked back at the mill, its windows now just empty eyes watching her departure. The face was gone, the window clear of any anomalies it had shown before. Returning to her cottage, Emily pondered the day's eerie discoveries. She transferred the photos to her computer, the images a stark contrast to the benign nature of her previous projects. As she scrolled through them, the face in the window appeared again and again, each time slightly different, as if shifting, reacting to her presence. What had she stumbled upon? A trick of light and shadow, or the imprint of a soul long bound to that old mill? As night fell and the village lights flickered on, casting soft glows against the darkening sky, Emily felt a mix of dread and excitement. The mill had revealed just enough to ensnare her curiosity further. Tomorrow, she would return. But tonight, she would sift through local archives and lore, seeking answers about the miller's disappearance and perhaps about the face that seemed so desperate to be seen. In the weeks that followed the ritual, the cottage settled into a strange harmony. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with unspoken dread, but there was an undeniable presence lingering at the edges of Eleanor's awareness. She began to notice subtle changes, things that might have seemed inconsequential to anyone else but held deep meaning to her. The once faded wildflowers in the garden now thrived, their vibrant colors returning in hues that seemed almost otherworldly. The whispers that had once sent shivers down her spine softened into a kind of lullaby, a gentle reassurance that she was never truly alone. Eleanor spent more time exploring the woods, feeling the pull of their quiet mystery. The grove around the well became a sanctuary, a place where she could sit and feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath her. The whispers were still there, but they had changed. They were no longer pleading, but instead seemed to carry a sense of gratitude. The spirit, whatever it truly was, had accepted her as its keeper, and in return, it offered her a strange kind of companionship. The villagers, too, grew more comfortable in her presence. Though they never spoke openly of the pact, their demeanor toward her had shifted. They greeted her with cautious smiles and nodded in quiet respect as she passed. There was an unspoken understanding that she had taken on a role they neither envied nor questioned. One of the elders, the same man who had warned her about the importance of the pact, stopped her in the market one day. He pressed a small, intricately carved charm into her hand and whispered, "For protection. Even a guardian needs to be guarded." Despite the newfound peace, Eleanor could not entirely shake the sense of something unfinished. Her dreams persisted, though they were no longer filled with fear. Instead, they were hauntingly beautiful, images of the woods bathed in moonlight, the well glowing faintly, and shadowy figures watching from the edges, their faces obscured but their intentions no longer hostile. These dreams felt like messages, reminders of the delicate balance she now maintained. One evening, as she organized her grandmother's journals and papers, she found something she had missed before: a thin, leather-bound book hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer. Its pages were filled with an unfamiliar script, one that seemed to shift and shimmer as she tried to focus on it. At the very back of the book was a single blank page, except for a name written in her grandmother's handwriting: Eleanor. The sight of her name there sent a chill through her, though not one of fear. It felt as though her grandmother had known all along that she would be the one to take up this mantle. The book seemed to hum faintly in her hands, its weight far heavier than its physical size. She set it aside, unsure of what to make of it, but the discovery left her with a lingering unease that she couldn't quite shake. In the nights that followed, Eleanor began to notice small changes again, though these were different from before. The shadows that had once retreated seemed to creep back, just at the edges of her vision. The music box, which had been silent since the ritual, played faintly in the middle of the night, the tune slower and more melancholic than before. The whispers grew louder, though their tone was not hostile. Instead, they carried a sense of urgency, as if trying to convey something she could not yet understand. One night, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, Eleanor returned to the grove. The woods were silent, their usual symphony of rustling leaves and chirping insects absent. The air was still, almost heavy, and the moonlight seemed dimmer than usual. At the well, she found the surface of the water disturbingly still, reflecting her face back at her with an unsettling clarity. As she stood there, the whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice. It was neither male nor female, young nor old, but something in between. A voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the well and from within her own mind. "The pact is kept," it said, "but the balance is fragile." Eleanor felt a chill run through her as the voice continued, speaking in riddles and fragments that hinted at an unending cycle. The spirit was bound to the woods, but its existence was tied to the actions of the villagers and their guardian. The balance she had restored was not permanent. It required vigilance and understanding, an ongoing commitment to the unseen forces that shaped the world around her. As the voice faded, the water in the well rippled, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw something moving beneath the surface, something vast and ancient, watching her with a quiet intensity. The moment passed, and the grove returned to its usual stillness, but the encounter left her deeply unsettled. Back at the cottage, Eleanor sat by the fire, the leather-bound book in her lap. She opened it to the blank page with her name and placed her hand over the text. For a brief moment, she felt a warmth beneath her palm, as though the book were alive. When she removed her hand, new words had appeared beneath her name. "The keeper endures." The phrase echoed in her mind as she stared into the fire. She realized then that her role was not just about maintaining the pact. It was about understanding the intricate web of connections between the natural and the supernatural, the living and the dead. The pact was not a single act but a continuous thread, one that required her to weave her own life into its fabric. As the days turned to weeks, Eleanor settled into her new reality. The cottage and the woods became her world, a space where the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted. The music box continued to play its enigmatic tunes, and the whispers never truly faded, but they became part of the rhythm of her life. The villagers, too, seemed to accept her role, offering quiet support when needed, but never prying into her affairs. Eleanor often returned to the grove, not out of fear, but out of a sense of duty and connection. She knew now that her presence there was as much for her own understanding as it was for the spirit. The well remained a constant reminder of the pact's weight and the balance she was sworn to uphold. The story did not end with a neat conclusion. There were no clear answers, no definitive resolutions. Eleanor's life had become a delicate dance with the unknown, a responsibility she carried with both trepidation and reverence. As the whispers wove through the woods and the music box played its haunting melodies, she understood that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, only lived. And in that understanding, she found a strange, enduring peace. In a quaint village nestled among dense, whispering forests and misty hills, Emily found her new sanctuary. Recently escaping the chaotic pace of city life, she was drawn to the tranquility and stories woven into the fabric of this place. Her neighbors were few, mostly older, their faces etched with the lines of many winters and eyes twinkling with secrets of the past. The village's centerpiece, spoken of in hushed tones and often with a glance thrown over the shoulder, was the old mill. Abandoned for decades, it sat on the outskirts, bordering the dense woods that some dared not enter as night fell. Emily, with her keen interest in folklore and an eye for photography, became captivated by the tales surrounding the mill. The most chilling was of the miller who vanished without a trace one stormy night, leaving behind only his hat and a lantern still burning by the now-still millstone. Armed with her camera, Emily set out one overcast morning to capture the essence of the mill. The path was well trodden at the start, villagers frequently coming this close, but no further. As she approached, the air grew damp, the sky a heavier gray, as if the place itself consumed the light. The mill, cloaked in ivy, its walls stooped with age, stood as a guardian of forgotten times. Upon her arrival, she was greeted by the unexpected sight of an open door, as if the mill itself had been expecting her. The wind seemed to whisper around her, rustling through the trees and the decrepit wooden slats of the mill with a soft, mournful whistle. Emily stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space that smelled of old wood and earth. It was cooler here, the light dim, filtered through the dirty windows and casting eerie shadows. Her first photo was meant to capture the general aura of the interior. However, when she reviewed the image, her breath caught. There, in the upper window that she could see through the open loft, was the vague outline of a face. It wasn't there when she had looked up moments before. Or had it been? The photo showed what her eyes had missed, or perhaps what only her camera could see. Intrigued and unnerved, Emily ventured deeper into the mill. Each room told a story of years passed in silence. Tools lay scattered, and the personal effects of the miller were dust-covered but undisturbed. As she made her way through the narrow corridors and up the creaking stairs, her camera unexpectedly clicked, capturing photo after photo without her command. Each frame revealed subtle changes not visible to her naked eye. Shadows lengthened, the outlines of figures almost perceptible in the periphery. Her heart raced slightly, the thrill of the ghostly intertwining with fear. She paused, considering the elders' warnings of the mill. Their words were meant as cautionary tales, not invitations. Yet here she was, driven by a desire to peel back the veil of mystery shrouding this place. The whispers grew louder, a soft cacophony of sighs that seemed almost human. As if in response, her camera captured a particularly clear photo. A shadow standing at the foot of the stairs, tall and thin, its form blurred but unmistakably human. As the day waned, the interior of the mill darkened, urging Emily to leave. With every step toward the exit, the whispers grew fainter, the air lighter. Once outside, she breathed deeply, the fresh air expelling the heaviness from her lungs. She looked back at the mill, its windows now just empty eyes watching her departure. The face was gone, the window clear of any anomalies it had shown before. Returning to her cottage, Emily pondered the day's eerie discoveries. She transferred the photos to her computer, the images a stark contrast to the benign nature of her previous projects. As she scrolled through them, the face in the window appeared again and again, each time slightly different, as if shifting, reacting to her presence. What had she stumbled upon? A trick of light and shadow, or the imprint of a soul long bound to that old mill? As night fell and the village lights flickered on, casting soft glows against the darkening sky, Emily felt a mix of dread and excitement. The mill had revealed just enough to ensnare her curiosity further. Tomorrow, she would return. But tonight, she would sift through local archives and lore, seeking answers about the miller's disappearance and perhaps about the face that seemed so desperate to be seen. The following day, Emily approached the mill with a mix of trepidation and resolve, the local tales fresh in her mind, hinting at a darker underbelly to the village's quaint charm. The air was crisp, the path to the mill now familiar. With each step, an uncanny stillness seemed to settle over the landscape, the usual chatter of wildlife subdued as though the very forest held its breath. As she entered the mill, a sudden drop in temperature greeted her, the chill seeping through her clothes. The door swung shut behind her with a definitive thud, more purposeful than random, casting her into semi-darkness. The atmosphere inside felt denser today, almost expectant. Emily switched on her flashlight, its beams slicing through the darkness, dust particles dancing within the light like tiny specters. The mill's interior had transformed overnight. What was merely old and abandoned now seemed charged with a palpable sense of history watching, waiting. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic, like blood long since dried. She moved deeper into the mill, her camera at the ready, the device now seemingly an extension of her senses, her only intermediary in this dialogue with the unseen. The wooden floors groaned under her weight, the sound echoing off the walls, distorted as if something whispered back through the grooves of the aged wood. Emily paused, listening. The hum she had noticed yesterday was more pronounced today, a melodic drone that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was dissonant, yet oddly harmonious, mingling with a wind that murmured through broken panes. As she ascended the stairs to the upper levels, where the face had appeared in the window, the air grew colder, the boundary between the physical mill and whatever lingered growing thinner. Each step brought a flicker of shadows, as though the light from her flashlight was too harsh for the delicate balance of this place. At the top, the hallway stretched before her, doors lining either side, slightly ajar, as if inviting her to glance at the secrets held within. Choosing a room at random, Emily stepped inside. The room looked like it had been a storage area, but now, her camera revealed more. As it clicked away of its own accord, the photos displayed on the small screen showed the room in various states of disarray, items shifting places with each frame, as though captured in different moments in time. In one, a rope hung from a beam, swaying slightly though there was no breeze inside. In another, the rope was gone. Turning, Emily explored another room. This one felt intensely cold, and as she entered, her breath visible in the air, she heard a soft thud behind her. Whirling around, the door had shut. A wave of panic rose, but she suppressed it, focusing on the room's contents. An old loom sat in the corner, thread still attached, and her flashlight caught something glinting beneath it. It was a small, rusted key, half buried in the dirt floor. As she picked up the key, the hum intensified, now clearly a melody, sad and slow. It seemed to come from the loom itself. Tentatively, she touched the threads, half expecting them to disintegrate under her fingers, but they held firm, almost pulsing with a life of their own. The room felt alive with memories, each thread a carrier of stories long woven into the fabric of the mill's ghostly presence. The exploration continued, Emily documenting everything, her camera capturing images that seemed impossible. Shadows played across the walls, forming shapes that were almost human, then dissolving into nothingness as she tried to focus. The mill was revealing itself, piece by piece, an entity unto itself, each corner a chapter of its haunted history. Outside, the wind picked up, the trees around the mill swaying with a sudden ferocity. Inside, it was as if that external chaos spurred an increase in activity. The melody grew louder, joined by a low moaning that seemed to seep through the very floorboards. It was as though the mill itself mourned, its sorrow echoing through time, a lament for all that had been lost here. Emily felt a kinship with this place now, its sadness intertwining with her own sense of isolation and longing for connection. But as the day waned, she knew she must leave, the mill's secrets still veiled in shadow, its whispers urging her to return. As she stepped outside, the door closing softly behind her, the sounds inside ceased abruptly, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of moments before. Returning to the village, her mind was a whirl of images and sounds, the day's experiences embedding themselves deep within her psyche. She had come seeking ghosts, armed with her camera and curiosity, but as she lay in bed that night, the haunting melody playing over in her mind, she realized she had found much more. The mill wasn't just a place, but a presence, an echo of the past that refused to be silenced, that demanded to be heard. And she would listen. The next morning brought a thick fog that clung to the village like a shroud, obscuring the path to the mill but not deterring Emily. With each visit, she felt more drawn to the place, its mysteries intertwining with her own resolve to uncover the truth. The air was heavy, laden with moisture that muffled sounds and blurred the edges of reality. Today, Emily carried not just her camera but also a notebook, intent on documenting every detail, no matter how minor it seemed. Entering the mill, the door no longer resisted. It swung open quietly as if it too recognized her repeated presence. The interior was shrouded in shadows, the light from outside struggling to penetrate the dense fog. The atmosphere inside was different today, charged, as if the mill itself anticipated the uncovering of its secrets. Emily made her way to the hidden room she had discovered previously, the one with the diary and the old ledgers. The air here was thick with the scent of old paper and whispered secrets. She sat down, opening the diary to the last entry she had read. The miller's words about something unseen that he claimed came with the wind. The handwriting was erratic, the ink blotted as if written in haste, or perhaps fear. As she read, the mill around her seemed to respond. The humming was no longer just a melody but had voices layered within it, multiple tones intertwining, some clear and others a distant echo. The temperature dropped, her breath visible, each exhale a cloud in the cold air. She could feel the presence of something or someone watching, waiting. The diary revealed more today. The miller spoke of a legend, old even in his time, about the mill being a place between worlds, a thin place where the veil was so sheer that those on the other side could sometimes reach through. He wrote of seeing figures in the shadows, of hearing his name whispered on the wind that turned his mill's wheels. He believed he was chosen to keep the balance, to ensure that whatever existed on the other side stayed there. But fear had crept into his words by the last page. He feared he was losing control, that whatever he kept at bay was becoming too strong for him. Emily paused, the weight of the miller's confession settling on her. She looked around, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. The mill felt alive, its old beams groaning under the weight of untold stories. She continued her exploration, drawn to the upper floors by a compulsion she couldn't explain. Upstairs, the air was colder still, the fog seeping through the cracks in the walls and floorboards. Her flashlight beam caught on something, carvings on the wooden beams of the ceiling. They were symbols, ancient and intricate, their meanings lost to time but their intentions clear. They were wards, protective seals. The miller had tried to fortify this place against whatever he feared. In the loft, the source of the whispers became apparent. A large, old millstone stood at the center, its surface worn but the symbols carved into it mirroring those on the beams. Emily approached, her hand hovering over the stone. As she touched it, the air around her vibrated, a pulse of energy that rippled through the room. The voices grew louder, a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the millstone itself. They spoke of memories, of lives long past, and of the thin veil that had once been guarded so carefully. The miller's voice was among them, sorrowful yet urgent, warning of the weakening barriers. Emily stepped back, her mind racing. The mill was more than a building. It was a gateway, a keeper of balances that the miller had maintained. And now, with his disappearance, the balance was tipping. As the day drew to a close, the fog outside began to lift, but the air inside the mill remained thick with energy and history. Emily knew what she needed to do. She would return, not just to explore but to restore, to take up the miller's mantle and keep the gateway secure. Her role had evolved from observer to guardian, her connection to the mill deepening into a responsibility she had never anticipated. Leaving the mill that evening, Emily felt a mix of fear and determination. She was no longer just a visitor. She was part of the mill's legacy, woven into its very fabric. The whispers followed her out, fading only as the door closed behind her. The echo of the miller's voice a lingering presence in her ears, a reminder of the task that lay ahead. She would be back, not just to listen but to act. As night fell over the village, Emily sat at her small wooden desk, her notebook open, the pages filled with fragments of the miller's diary, hastily scribbled notes, and sketches of the symbols she had discovered. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock, but her mind was anything but still. The mill's presence lingered with her, its whispers faintly echoing in her thoughts. She had come seeking stories, but she had found something far greater, something she could no longer ignore. The weight of the miller's unspoken plea hung heavy over her. It was clear now why he had disappeared. He had been overwhelmed by the very forces he had sought to contain. Emily wondered if he had left willingly, perhaps giving himself to the other side to buy the village more time, or if the barrier had claimed him in the end. Either way, his task had been left unfinished, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the mill had chosen her to continue it. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside her window seemed to carry an unspoken message. By the early hours of the morning, she had made up her mind. She would return to the mill one last time, not to explore, but to bring it peace, if such a thing was even possible. The fog had lifted by morning, replaced by a pale winter sun that cast long shadows over the village. Emily prepared herself carefully, gathering a few supplies and the small, rusted key she had found. She felt its weight in her pocket, its cold metal pressing against her palm as she walked the now familiar path to the mill. The villagers watched her leave, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. They didn't ask where she was going. Perhaps they already knew. The mill greeted her in silence, the door ajar, its dark interior seeming to stretch further than it had before. The air was colder, sharper, as though the place itself braced for what was to come. Emily stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. The hum began almost immediately, soft at first but building with each step she took. It was no longer a melody but a low, resonant vibration, as if the mill itself was alive and aware of her purpose. She moved to the upper floors, the symbols on the beams seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. The millstone in the loft stood as it had before, its surface smooth and worn, the protective carvings etched into its edges. But now, Emily saw something she hadn't noticed before. A small indentation in the center, perfectly shaped to fit the key she carried. Her heart raced as she approached. The whispers grew louder, an indistinct chorus of voices that seemed to both urge her forward and warn her away. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the key. This was it, the moment that would either restore the mill's balance or tip it into chaos. Sliding the key into the indentation, she felt a resistance, as though the mill itself tested her resolve. She turned it slowly, the mechanism clicking into place with an audible snap. The hum around her intensified, the vibrations running through the floor and up into her body. The air grew impossibly cold, and for a moment, all sound ceased. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the entire world had paused to watch. Then, the millstone began to turn. It moved slowly at first, groaning under the weight of years of stillness, but soon it gained momentum. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, the light pulsating in rhythm with the vibrations in the air. The voices rose in a crescendo, no longer whispers but a clear, unified chant in a language Emily couldn't understand. The walls of the mill seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and shifting, taking on shapes that flickered just at the edge of her vision. And then it stopped. The millstone ground to a halt, the light fading from its carvings. The air grew still, the cold lifting as warmth slowly returned to the space. The voices were gone, replaced by a profound silence that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. Emily stood there, her hand resting on the edge of the millstone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know what she had done, only that the oppressive weight of the mill's sorrow seemed to have lifted. As she made her way back down, she noticed subtle changes. The air felt lighter, the light streaming through the windows brighter. The symbols on the beams, once faint and faded, now appeared sharp and new, as though they had been refreshed by whatever had just transpired. The mill no longer felt like a place of fear, but one of quiet power, a sentinel watching over the vale. Emily stepped outside, the sunlight warm against her face. The forest seemed alive again, the birdsong and rustling leaves a stark contrast to the heavy silence of her previous visits. She turned to look back at the mill, its windows glinting in the light. For the first time, it looked like a part of the village, not apart from it. The walk back felt longer, each step filled with a sense of finality. As she reached the village, the elders who had warned her before now watched her with quiet reverence. They didn't ask what had happened, and she didn't offer an explanation. Some things, she realized, were better left as mysteries. That night, as she lay in bed, the miller's voice came to her one last time. Not in a whisper, but in a single, clear sentence that echoed in her mind. Thank you, it was enough. Emily closed her eyes, sleep coming easily for the first time since she had arrived in the village. The mill's story was not over, but her part in it had come to an end. And somewhere in the distance, the mill stood quietly, its purpose restored, its secrets safe once more.